Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Devon, and I'm the Vice Chair of JSpaceCanada and the moderator for today's webinar. First of all, I want to thank everyone who's joining us today at this most unusual time. Of course, we hope you're keeping safe, and our thoughts are with the first responders, frontline workers, and patients affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's webinar is titled Unity, Israel's Emergency Government and the Future of Annexation, Canadian and Israeli Perspectives. For those of you who are joining a JSpaceCanada event for the first time, welcome. Since 2011, JSpaceCanada has served as a voice for pro-peace, pro-Israel Canadians, made up of volunteers who share a deep commitment to a lasting resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today's discussion comes at a critical moment for the region. A deal has been reached for a new Israeli government coming mere months after the Trump administration proposed a new framework for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Today, our guests will be talking about the implications of these events in Israel, in Canada, and around the world. A 40-minute discussion will be followed by a 20-minute question and answer period. If you have any questions, please submit them to the question and answer section on Zoom, and we'll do our best to get through all the questions. Today, we're joined by expert individuals who offer a unique perspective on Israel's new government. We're pleased to have with us Jon Allen, who's a senior fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School and served as Canada's ambassador to Israel from 2006 to 2010. He's a member of JSpaceCanada's advisory board and sits on the board of the Canadian wing of Project Rosanna, an international multi-faith nonprofit that supports Israeli-Palestinian partnership in healthcare. We're also joined by Judy Maltz, who's a senior writer for the English edition of Haaretz, where she covers a wide range of topics with special emphasis on the Jewish world and Israel diaspora relations. Born in the United States, Judy now is based in Tel Aviv, where she has lived for some time. So, Judy, I'll start with you, and I think it's the question that many of us have, which is how did we get here and where are we right now? So if you could provide an overview of the past year and how we got to this new emergency government.
Okay, so how did we get here? I think there are two main reasons we are where we are today. And one of them, as you mentioned, is the fact that we've had 3 elections within the course of less than a year, each of which ended pretty much in a stalemate. And I'll explain that in a second. The other reason is obviously coronavirus. That's what created the emergency situation. So those are the two things. Let's talk about the stalemate. What do I mean by a stalemate? So I think a little background is in order here on how Israeli politics work. We have a Knesset, which is parliament with 120 seats. 2 big parties. One is Likud. The other one used to be Labor, and this time it's blue-white, which I would argue is kind of Labor, but repackaged a little. And to form a government in Israel, you need a majority of the seats in the Knesset, which is 61. So in each of these 3 elections, we had one on April 9th. I remember that one because my daughter's birthday is on April 11th, and she turned 18 then, so she was 2 days short of voting, and she was very upset. So it was April 9th, September 17th, and March 2nd. In each of these elections, the 2 biggest parties that emerged were Likud and blue-white, Kahalavan, as they're known in Israel. But neither one of them was able to cobble together a government of 61. In the first election, Likud came out a little bigger. In the second election, it was blue-white. In the third election, it was Likud, but it didn't matter. Neither of them got to the 61. There was, however, a very important development between election number 2 and election number 3. In November of 2019, our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was indicted on charges of corruption, on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. So this was a bit of a game changer because his opponents, the big party, blue-white, had until then said, we will never sit in a government under someone who is facing indictments, okay? Now, Benny Gantz, who is the head of the Blue-White Party, did have another option. There is the option in Israel of setting up a minority government, which is an option in other parliamentary democracies as well. And he could have done that because for the first time in history, we had a situation in Israel where the Arab parties, and right now there is one big Arab party, which is made up of 4 factions, and it's known as the Arab List. And I'm calling it an Arab party, even though it does have one Jewish member, and it likes to depict itself as a Jewish Arab party, but it is really a party that most of its voters are Arab Israelis, and 14 of its 15 members in the Knesset are Arab Israelis. The Joint List, after election number 2, 12 of its 15 members, no, it wasn't 15, but let's just say most of its, because I can't remember now offhand how many it had, but it was less than 15 in the second round. Most of them, except for one faction known as Balad, which is the more radical faction in this Joint List, really doesn't accept the idea of a Jewish state. So most of the members went to the president and said, we believe you should give Benny Gantz the job of forming the next government. That was really unprecedented. After election number 3, all 15 members, including the more radical Balad faction, went to the president and said, we think you should give Benny Gantz the job. And in fact, they said, we're not even asking to be part of this government. All we're saying is that when there is a vote, we will vote in favor and then stay out. We're not going to be part of it. Gantz got cold feet, though. He was afraid to form a minority government that would have been supported by the Arab-led Joint List. And it's not unprecedented in Israel. This is important to say. It's not unprecedented that you would have a minority government that is supported by Arab parties. When did it happen? It happened in the early 90s when Yitzhak Rabin, the late prime minister, was in office. And at one point, one of his coalition partners pulled out. And he didn't have a majority any longer. And at that point, he needed to get the second part of the Oslo peace agreements approved. And he relied on support from outside the government on the Arab parties. So it's happened before. So why didn't Gantz want to do this? What was he so scared of? There were a couple things. Number one, he made a promise that he would not form a government that relied on support from the Joint List. Okay, and he said, I'm not going to break that promise. By the way, we know he also made another promise that he wouldn't sit under a prime minister who had been indicted, but I guess when he said which is worse, he decided it would have been worse to get support from the Arab parties. The other thing is that the Likud, as part of its campaign against the Joint List, kept calling this party supporters of terror, supporters of terror. And as you know, sometimes if you repeat a lie enough times, it begins to sink in. And I really believe that Gantz was afraid that the Israeli public had come to believe that the Joint List was a party of terror supporters, and that made him even extra scared. Finally, Benny Gantz was starting to face defections within his own center-left bloc. It started with Orly Levy, who was the head of the Gesher Party, which is a party that fused together with Labor before the September election. And she said, nope, I will not support this government. I will not sit together or even get any support from the Arab Joint List. and she pulled out. Then there were two members of the blue-white party who said, no, we will not agree to any minority government that is supported from outside by the Arab Party. And we don't care if it's just for only one vote. So Benny Gantz's tiny little majority that he had over the right-wing bloc was starting to dissolve with these three defections. And I think he seriously feared that Netanyahu would do something to bring over one or two more people from his bloc, and then he wouldn't even have a majority with the minority government and the Arabs together. So he pulled out. So I want to say here, do I have time or just to say, okay, I want to just provide a little background about what blue-white is, because it's a very new party and suddenly the second biggest party in Israel. I mean, it was in September the biggest party in Israel. So what is this blue-white? Started a little over a year ago when Benny Gantz, who's a former chief of staff with absolutely no political experience whatsoever, nobody knew really where he was coming from or what he believed. And I still think they don't know. And I'm not sure he even knows, right? And he's very handsome, and he does bring the aura of having been a commander, and pretty well-liked guy, no controversy. And people were looking for someone to take over as an alternative because the Labor Party has failed time and again. So what he did is he hooked up with, first he formed his own party, with this awful name, Resilience of Israel. And he teamed up with Yesh Atid, which is a party that hasn't been around for all that long, but 5, 6, 7, 8 years. But it's done well. It's a very centrist party. Its main platform has been stopping religious coercion in Israel. And therefore, it's a party that is very much hated by the ultra-Orthodox. So he teamed up with Yesh Atid. Then he brought in a new small party called Telem, which was headed by another former chief of staff, Moshe Ya'alon, who used to be in Likud, but he had a terrible fallout with Netanyahu when he was defense minister. So he just was looking for a new platform, a new political platform. And finally, they brought in a third former ex-chief of staff, Gabi Ashkenazi. So it was really a party that had 4 heads, even though Gantz was number 1. And then when the corona virus crisis erupted, there was a split within blue-white. Yesh Atid and Telem, two of the 4 factions, decide, we don't care. We will not sit with Netanyahu. Never. We promised we would rather form a minority government and have it supported from the outside by the Arab-led joint list. But Gantz and Ashkenazi, the 2 former chiefs of staff, both of whom have no political experience, got scared, and they decided to go with Netanyahu. And so blue-white split, even though Gantz got to keep the name. So it's still called blue-white. And I guess that's how we got here today. So yes, as you said, we do have an agreement, but it's still not a done deal because just today, the Supreme Court of Israel began deliberations on several petitions that say a man who is facing indictments cannot serve as a prime minister of Israel. And they're asking for the Supreme Court to intervene. Tomorrow, the Supreme Court will begin deliberations on other petitions which say that the whole agreement that was signed between Likud and Benny Gantz is unconstitutional for various reasons. I'm not going to go into that. But it's just important to say that this is not a done deal and it can all fall apart.
No, that's certainly really insightful. what is, I guess, certain of the within the agreement itself is an agreement on the date that they can begin discussions on topics like annexation in line with the Trump administration's plan, proposed plan for Middle East peace. Jon, I'm wondering if you can talk to what we can expect to see in terms of movement on this front, specifically with regards to annexation of territory in the West Bank.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks, Judy, and thanks to JSpace. Well, if there is a lack of clarity about whether Bibi can serve as prime minister, and if there's a lack of clarity about whether this agreement can move forward, there's clearly a lack of clarity about annexation. Annexation could mean a minimalist annexation, which would be Male Adumim, Gush Etzion, and some settlements close to the Green Line, which have generally been understood would remain with Israel in any agreement with the Palestinians. And there would be swaps within Israel to balance them off. That's the least probably likely situation, but it's a possibility. Another situation is an effort by Bibi and the Likud faction to take as much land and as little Palestinian population as possible to minimize the demographic threat that an annexation might pose. But let me move to the maximalist position, which is the position that was in the Trump plan and is the most dangerous, from my perspective, for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's also dangerous in terms of Israel's national security, and it's dangerous for stability in the region. And the maximalist position would mean all of the existing settlements, that's Male Adumim and Gush Etzion and 25 more, plus the Jordan Valley. And if Israel were to move on that, it would be a tectonic shift, as a number of generals have already stated in a report on annexation. Why a tectonic shift? Because the world, including the US until Trump, have always considered this area as to be occupied territory, and occupied territory cannot be annexed because it's contrary to international law. Israel rejected the term occupied territory, but they always, even right now on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, call it disputed territory. And the implication of that was it would be negotiated. You would negotiate the dispute within the context of the two-state solution, and there would be a resolution. What's happening now is not a negotiation, not a mediation, but a unilateral land grab. That is the possibility. And that unilateral land grab of a 30% of the West Bank could have very, very serious consequences. It could jeopardize the agreement that Israel has with Jordan, which has real serious security implications. It could jeopardize the agreement it has with the Palestinians, which also would have security implications because the Palestinians have been essential in minimizing terrorism from the West Bank into Israel in their cooperation with Israel. And of course, and we can talk about this later, it could have serious consequences for relations with the United States and with the rest of the world, who may or may not react very strongly to this. And we'll have to see what happens. But it's clearly problematic, and we'll be waiting to see what the reaction of various parties are going to be.
And I guess on that topic, and perhaps Judy, you can speak to this. What is public opinion in Israel towards annexation?
Well, we've got two pretty recent surveys. one by the Institute of National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, and one by the Israel Democracy Institute. And they're more or less showing a similar trend, which is that more Israelis are opposed to annexation than in favor of it. So the INS one, which is from January, found that 45% are opposed to any unilateral annexation. However, 26% of Israelis did support unilateral annexation of the settlement blocks, which John mentioned. 14% favored unilateral annexation of all the settlement areas. 7% are in favor of the entire West Bank, which nobody is really talking about because nobody really wants Israel to control. Not even the biggest right-wingers in Israel are thinking about Israel controlling Ramallah or Jenin or any of those areas. And 8% are in favor of annexation of what is known as Area C. And Area C is where most of the settlements are. So that's pretty much the Trump plan. So the Israel Democracy Institute in its survey, which was in December, found a little less than INSS. 36.6% were in favor of annexation, while 42.1% were opposed. Another 21.3% didn't know or refused to answer. What is clear is among Israelis, support for annexation, and this is pretty obvious, I guess, is stronger among Jewish Israelis than it is among Arab Israelis. But another important question to look at is, how do Israelis feel today about the two-state solution, which is kind of the opposite side of the coin? So I guess pretty remarkably, despite everything, there is still a plurality, not a majority, but a plurality of Israelis that favor the two-state solution. And this has always been the case. Support for the two-state solution has obviously gone down since the 90s when there were the Oslo Accords, and we had a leader who was in favor of a two-state solution. But even so, more than 40%, I think the last survey shows 45% of Israelis support that option. And the other options, whether they're a one-state solution with equal rights for everyone, or a one-state solution, which is an apartheid state where only Jews get full rights, there's much less support for any of those options.
Maybe I'll just jump in, Jordan, for a second, say I agree 100% with what Judy said. I was listening to Yossi Alfer the other day, and he was commenting that if you listen to the Israeli news, if you've got a 30-minute news, 25 minutes are now on COVID and the economy, and 5 minutes are on maybe the national unity government and the court cases. And so the danger, I guess, is that if you ask Israelis one thing, you'll get an answer. But I think the fact is that most Israelis are not paying much attention to annexation at this minute. They're not paying nearly as much attention as we diaspora Jews, progressive Jews who are concerned about the two-state solution are, I think, in some cases. And it's really going to be up to either progressive advocacy groups in Israel or Gantz and Ashkenazi within the cabinet, or the IDF and the Shin Bet and others to begin raising the issues that various kinds of annexation may pose. Because otherwise, I think, given the concerns of Israelis for their everyday life, they could walk into this and all of a sudden in July or August have a plan that they might not otherwise like.
Can I just add something to what Jon said? A couple months ago, I did a big project about young Israelis and how they feel about different issues. And one of the most surprising things was, this is a new generation, unlike their parents, probably never, unless they live there, they've never crossed the green line. Certainly never gone deep into the territories. They've never visited settlements. And when you start asking them questions about annexation, two-state solution, I mean, these are kids who were born after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. They really have no idea what you're talking about. They don't know. They don't know the issues. It's not something that they learn about in high school. It's too controversial, obviously. So they're not taught. And you could hear from their answers that they don't understand the question. It's just not relevant for them. So that's a big part of the Israeli public.
Well, and I think what both of you folks mentioned brings up the question around, does annexation in a minimal capacity or in the maximalist approach, did that bring about the death of the two-state solution? Should we still be talking in the parameters of the two-state solution discourse? Because certainly organizations like JSpaceCanada are strong advocates for a two-state solution, but many supporters are concerned about, if this government goes forward with annexation, is a two-state solution still realistic? And I'll open it up to both of you.
Well, I think a maximalist position and a maximalist annexation would be a serious threat to the two-state solution. It would create a Bantustan. It would make it extremely difficult to have a viable state. It would also more fundamentally threaten the credibility of the Palestinian Authority. I mean, if Mahmoud Abbas has to turn to his people and say, we're faced with the Trump peace plan, which is a complete disaster. We're faced with annexation, which means that you're going to need a visa to travel from the north to the south. We've lost East Jerusalem as our capital. Then you can see that the concerns that already exist within the Palestinian community about corruption and the fact that there's been no elections for 14 years, you can see the credibility of the Palestinian Authority dissipating and potentially disappearing, in which case Israel is going to be faced with the reality of occupying it completely and being responsible for the security of areas A, B, and C and the Jordan Valley. And what does that mean in terms of costs? What does it mean in terms of the requirement for the IDF and the Shin Bet to control that whole territory? And clearly it does mean the end of the two-state solution. And we know what the end of the two-state solution means. It means a one-state solution where Israel is either an apartheid state where the Jewish minority controls the Palestinian majority, or it's no longer a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state because there'll be a Palestinian majority. So the consequences are real. And I think, and I hope that that people in Israel, like Gantz and Ashkenazi and the IDF, will begin to raise these concerns.
I would tend to agree with Jon. I'd also like to point out that based on past experience, if this happens, we can expect that there will be some sort of Palestinian uprising against it, young, frustrated Palestinians who just have had enough, and this will trigger it. And, even if it doesn't officially kill the two-state solution, all the violence and blood that will come out of this next uprising are going to make it that much harder to ever get back to a negotiating table again. You know, it's going to be another war.
You know, just following up, I think Judy's right. And if you take a look at the other side of the coin of the young Israelis who don't know what annexation is, you've got Palestinian youth who also were not born at the time of Oslo and are beginning to talk about the one-state solution. In other words, for some of them, the two-state solution is so far from reality that they're prepared to say, okay, make us Israeli citizens. We'll, like other Palestinian Israelis, we'll become part of the country and we'll take advantage of the benefits there of this democracy. And then you, as I suggest, move towards the problem of what kind of Israel do we have when 2.6 million West Bankers and Gazans decide that they're going to become Israeli citizens.
Jon, obviously there are many international implications of these developments. I just heard about a conference call of European ambassadors to the foreign ministry warning about annexation and what it would mean for the stability of the region, but also Israel's standing globally. I assume similar conversations are happening in a North American context and within Canada. As Canada increasingly wants to have a global presence. I know we're vying for a Security Council seat. We traditionally have been an honest broker, but also an ally towards Israel. What do you think the conversations are like within the Canadian foreign policy team? What do you think we can expect to see with regards to Canada's approach to Israel should this annexation route proceed as we think it might?
Well, if you go on to the Global Affairs Canada website, for example, and look at Middle East policy, you will see that the government strongly supports a two-state solution, that it opposes the occupation and considers it to be illegal in international law. Like the EU and of course, like the United States, up until Secretary Pompeo changed the US position on the occupation last year. So I would imagine that if the international community, whether at the UN or via a number of foreign ministers or leaders getting together with a statement, I think Canada would join a statement condemning an annexation of the maximalist kind. I don't think you're going to see Canada getting out in front on it. They do have a balanced position, but they will probably lead from behind, to quote Barack Obama, as opposed to being out front as the leader. But you have seen, you're right, you've seen the Europeans, the European foreign minister has said that this annexation would be illegal. You've seen the Arab League come out saying that this is a crime in international law. Exactly what the Saudis within the Arab League believe, we don't know. But, and also, most importantly, Biden, in his remarks to AIPAC and to J Street, has said that the annexation, he opposes the annexation. So we'll have to see where all of this leads.
Well, you bring up an interesting point on Joe Biden, and of course we have a major election coming up in the United States. What do you see as the greatest implications of the election on this? I've heard that Israelis are really thinking about the election as they make their decisions on what to do exactly with the region.
Well, yeah, I would think, this could be one of the factors that might slow the process down. I get probably the two main factors internationally are what do the Saudis really think? Are they behind this? Israel has been making a number of outreach efforts to the Gulfies and to the Saudis in particular, and there's a relationship between MBS and Jared Kushner. So what do the Saudis think? And we know what the Democrats think. So does Bibi and do Likud want to move forward, knowing that there's a possibility of having a collision with a Democratic president and potentially a Democratic Senate, which has significant power over foreign policy in the United States. And so he may want to take that into account. On the other hand, he may want to move very quickly if he can in order to get it done before Trump may be out of the White House. It's really unclear to me, how they're going to want to proceed.
Interesting. To bring the conversation back to Canada, JSpaceCanada, as I mentioned, we're supporters of a two-state solution. How can Canadian Jews and Jews in the diaspora exert their influence on developments in Israel or promote developments that bring about peace and maybe stop the trend towards annexation? And I know that's a loaded question, so I'll leave it to both of you to maybe to decipher the elements of that. I'll start with you, Judy.
Ooh, I think I'm going to say something a little controversial. I think if you really want to influence what's happening in Israel, this is a great time for young Canadian Jews, progressive Jews, to come move here and vote. Because I haven't seen anything else helping.
That's a very interesting proposition.
We've got much better weather than Canada, really good food. It turns out our healthcare system isn't that bad either.
Well, apart from that, I do think to some extent, I often feel like this naive diaspora Jew whistling in the wind in the face of hard-nosed Israelis who have the national interest at heart and think we're all high-eyed liberals. But then again, I look back at my own history and realize that the Israel that I grew up with had lots of room both for its national interests and its security and for a realization of the rights and the needs of the other, of which Jews were for a long time. So I think that Jews in Canada should do what they can. I think really, though, that we're not going to be able to do very much. We should do it. We should express ourselves, but we should also hope that that Joe Biden and the Democrats and the King of Jordan and maybe the West will finally say enough is enough and talk about imposing some sanctions, which they've never done. There has been creeping annexation, creeping expansion of settlements, but they've never really, intervened in a significant way. And if Israelis, realize that this annexation is not very different from what the Russians did in Crimea, and sanctions were imposed there, then maybe they'll think twice. Maybe Bibi will think twice, but I'm not sure.
Can I just add one thing? Do I have a minute?
Yeah.
So something a little bit more realistic than what I said before. During the 3 election rounds, I went to quite a few towns which were known as strongholds of the Likud, and trying to figure out why people there supported Bibi. Why did they like him? One of the things that kept coming up was they were saying he's a world leader. Look how everybody in the world loves him. He's constantly traveling and all these photographs with all the big leaders in the world. And it made me think that perhaps the way to reduce his popularity, sorry, is to have world leaders shun him. Instead of boycotting Israelis or taking sanctions against Israeli academia or good progressive-minded Israelis who really don't like Bibi either, maybe there should be sanctions against him, and maybe they should stop inviting him to world forums and events and meetings. And when he's not such a world leader, maybe people won't think he's so great.
That's certainly a fascinating approach. I'm going to actually move to the question and answer period now. So for everyone in attendance right now, and it looks like we have 112 participants, so thank you everyone for staying engaged. You have a question and answer section on your Zoom application, so feel free to answer or to send some questions over there, and we have a few in the queue already, so I'll start with some of them that we have here. David Brooks asks, what would you expect Jordan to do if the maximalist annexation approach is voted in? Maybe John, you can answer that.
Judy can certainly jump in as well. It's a tough one, obviously, for Jordan. They have a very, very significant security agreement with Israel. Some have said it's not about the border of the Jordan Valley, it's about the border between Iraq and Jordan that Jordan helps protect for Israel. And I think there would be no IDF general, including the many that are part of this government, that would deny that this is very important. As you know, the majority population in Jordan is Palestinian. And if the agreement were to go through, and if, for example, Jordan were to lose sovereignty over the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa, as is included in the Trump plan, you can see potentially the street in Jordan erupting and forcing the king to take some serious measures. So that would be very problematic. I should say, though, balancing that, the move of the American embassy to Jerusalem happened, and the violence that people predicted didn't happen. And so I don't know what will happen on the street in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt or in Ramallah, for that matter.
Although, John, we did get a lot of violence down on the Gaza border after that, if you remember.
That's right.
It wasn't coming from Jordan, but it was, and it did really paralyze the Gaza border region for more than a year.
It's true, absolutely.
We have a question here from Gabriella. Are the Palestinians mobilizing against annexation in any significant way?
The Saab Erekat and Mahmoud Abbas are. I'm not sure if the street is. Judy?
I haven't heard of it. I mean, fortunately now, I haven't heard of any protests or anything going on in the street, and we would have known about it, and it would have been, as bad as it is at any time. Just imagine if it was happening now with the coronavirus and clashes between protesters and soldiers. I mean, talking about a disaster. So far, thankfully, the street has been pretty quiet.
Of course, nothing is going to happen until July 1st, in a sense. Presumably, there will be activity behind the scenes as they move towards July 1st to try and figure out what they want to do, what they're thinking of doing. But July 1st is I guess it's a century away in the minds of some people right now.
One question here asks, a lot of what we've been speaking about today has been reactive, rather against annexation. What positive measures would we recommend that the Israeli government pursue to engage the Palestinian Authority?
Right now, you're saying, as
I think
the question, like in exchange for annexation, how can we make the Palestinians happy?
my reading of the question is, what could the international community do in a positive way to maybe rehash or re-engage both Israelis and Palestinians, restart the negotiation process? Is that a prospect that actually is on the horizon or feasible?
It doesn't seem like right now, with everything else going on. I mean, it seems like it's the last thing on the minds of world leaders or anyone. I mean, between Corona, not having a government in Israel, with the not government we have talking so seriously about annexation, I'm not really sure that, this is.
Sorry, there was a correction to the question. It was not the international community. What can Israel do instead of pursuing annexation? What are the options?
Not pursue it.
Not pursue annexation and not pursue any part of the Trump plan.
Yeah.
Is an anathema to the Palestinians. I mean, I think what Israel could do, obviously, is at some point in time, not now, but after, to begin to rethink its policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians, a policy of 11 years of rejection of the two-state solution, and try and find ways to reach into the Palestinian mindset. I know it's not easy. I'm not suggesting that Mahmoud Abbas is the ideal leader or that the Palestinian Authority is going to be open and easy or less corrupt than it is. So I think in some senses, as I've said, I think before, we need new leadership before anything significant is going to happen on both sides of the border.
A question here from Leslie Kelman asks, has anyone worked out the costs of annexation in terms of infrastructure costs, security costs? I believe, to answer this question with my own answer, I believe the Israel Policy Forum has a very interesting analysis from different security or former security and intelligence figures going through a cost by cost analysis and then security implications of annexation. But I am sure there's others. I'm sure this is a hot topic right now.
The Commanders for Israel Security, which is a group of 220 generals and equivalents in Shin Bet and Mossad, have done a very detailed economic analysis of the security implications, and not just the security implications, but the economic GDP implications if, as Judy suggested, the situation were to deteriorate. You can go to the CIS website and see there's a 40-page analysis, part of which is economic. They brought in economic experts to actually do it because they're not economic experts.
Judy, there's a question asked by Georgia Gardner with relating to a point that you made, that youth in Israel, or in your opinion, youth in Israel that you've engaged aren't as engaged on the issues as veteran Israelis or those of the older generation. What does this say about the future of Israel, or rather the future of Israeli leadership in politics?
They're not engaged in this issue, and I think I explained why they're not. I mean, there's one good reason they're not engaged, because compared with their parents' generation, this generation hasn't really had a war with many victims and many casualties. And if you look back historically, the peace movements in Israel were always triggered by wars. And the young people became active in response to the killing and the wars. So, I mean, we did have 6 years ago the war in Gaza, but it was not a major war. And relatively speaking, there were not many casualties. So this this is why I believe this generation, and I guess it's for good, they're laid back. They're more laid back than their parents and grandparents were. But there are other issues that engage them, and they are definitely active. I can tell you right now that, during this whole coronavirus crisis, it's young people who are before the army, waiting to go into the army, after army, are doing tons of volunteer work around the country, giving out food, doing lots of wonderful things. It's this issue which they just can't relate. It's not, they don't travel there, they don't have to fight over it, and it's not something that interests them, unfortunately.
One question here asks about Benny Gantz, and specifically talk about him potentially accepting whatever the Supreme Court says with regards to high court petitions on the unity government, and that he'd accept it. So let's say the Supreme Court rules against the new government. Does that mean Israelis have to go to a fourth election? What do we expect to see if that happens?
Yeah, I think there's pretty much a consensus that if most people don't believe that the Supreme Court will say that Netanyahu can't form a government, okay? But there seems to be a bit of consensus that the Supreme Court can say that certain elements of the coalition agreement between Blue, White, and Likud are unconstitutional. If certain elements come out, that's it. There's no agreement, and we're heading for a fourth election, which I don't believe will be a bad thing.
Can I ask you, Judy? It was suggested that one of the reasons that Benny Gantz formed this government was because the polls. Now, it was granted the polls were taken in the midst of COVID, and every leader gets a bump because of and Netanyahu deserves a bump given what he's done under COVID. But anyways, one of the reasons was that Gantz was worried that Bibi would have a clear majority, and that efforts to rein in the attacks on the rule of law and the Supreme Court and everything would go by the wayside, and a right-wing government would come in. So you say that it might not be a bad thing. I'm wondering how maybe it would be a bad thing if you are concerned about a majority Bibi government, etc.
Well, you have to realize that right now we have more than 1 million Israelis who are unemployed because of the coronavirus. And even as the restrictions are lifted, it's not clear that many of them will be able to reopen their businesses or go back to work. So there's going to be a huge this is record unemployment. I think it's 25%. It's huge. It's huge. And so I don't think that yet has been factored into these polls. People are happy now that originally they were predicting tens of thousands of dead. And fortunately, it's been just 200 plus. But once we're over that and we start seeing the effects on the economy, that's going to be a different story. So I think, that's maybe the reason that Netanyahu agreed in the end to this coalition government rather than going right away for a fourth election, because he knows as well that in a few months from now, there are people protesting every night here out in Israel. There are people, business owners, well, there are also the leftists who are out there, but there are a lot of hardcore Likud supporters. Many of them own small businesses. They have, little stands in the markets. The markets are still closed, and they're angry. They're very, very angry.
A question here from Barbara Landau asks if there are any promising prospects for future Palestinian leaders. And I guess I also saw a question earlier that was about promising prospects for future Israeli leaders. So I'm wondering if either of you can speak to the future, the next generation of political leadership in both Palestine and Israel.
So I don't know how many of you in Canada have heard about somebody who's kind of being talked about as the up and coming leader of the Zionist left in Israel these days. His name is Yair Golan. He was a deputy chief of staff. I think that's going to be something that may harm him because we've had too many chiefs of staffs who have not delivered the goods in recent months. But he actually came to the public's attention while he was still in uniform, and he gave a speech on Holocaust Memorial Day a few years ago, which was considered very controversial, because he talked about a process in Israel that reminded him of processes that were taking place in Germany in the early 1930s. And unlike some of the other army guys, he is not afraid to call himself a leftist. He is very honest about where he stands. He was part of the Zionist, I don't even remember what they were called in the Zionist, no, not the Zionist Union. It was the left-wing coalition of Labor, Meretz, and Ehud Barak. He was part of that.
Yeah.
And now I think officially he's part of Meretz, but a lot of people think that he may have more widespread appeal as a leader of the Israeli left than the current leaders. So he's an interesting guy to follow, Yair Golan. He's on Twitter. I think he only tweets in Hebrew, so that might be a problem. But keep an eye out for him.
And can we speak at all to Palestinian leadership? Of course, it's competing leadership, and there's completely different landscape when it comes to factionalism and factions there. Yeah. But any young blood or emerging voices that will take the mantle from current leadership, Mahmoud Abbas?
I don't know politically who's up and coming, but I do know that in my dealings with Project Rosanna, where we deal on a regular basis with youngish Palestinians in their 40s, in their 30s and 40s, there's a whole generation of Palestinians who've had enough of the corruption and the tribalism and really want the state, their state, to move forward. And I would assume that there are people who could step in. I would hope, I shouldn't assume, I would hope there are people that when this generation finally passes, there are people who could step in and push back some of that traditional control that factions in Palestine, and whether in Ramallah or in Gaza, had. Of course, bringing together Hamas and Fatah is going to have to be key, and that's not going to be easy either. So I don't think we should be unrealistic about the difficulties, and we shouldn't put all the blame on Israel. But Israel as the major power, as the country with all the control, in my view, has to at some point take a chance on peace. And that's what JSpace is all about. Let's take a chance on peace and try and move this process forward.
On that note, I'll get to our final question, which was sent prior. In your experience, and this is directed to both of you, are there any organizations or movements or individuals who are on the front lines mobilizing, whether it's for Israeli-Palestinian partnership, whether it's for advancing a two-state solution, whether it's just for shared existence and mutual cooperation, that you would recommend that JSpaceCanada and our members look into, whether it's supporting financially or volunteering or staying up to date with?
So I would recommend 3 here in Israel. One of them is Sikkuy, S-I-K-K-U-Y. It's a wonderful organization that promotes shared society in Israel. Another one is the Abraham Fund Initiatives, which was very, very active in getting out the Arab vote in the last 2 elections. And, you know, maybe I should have mentioned this, but the fact that so many Arabs went out and voted is what made this such a close race between the center left on one hand and the right wing. Okay, so they were very, very important in doing that. And there's a new organization, relatively new organization called Omdim Biyachad, which means standing together, which is a joint Jewish Arab organization. And I think they are going to be doing a lot of work on trying to get a real Jewish Arab party to run in the next election, whenever that may be.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We'll make sure that we write these resources down. So if anyone didn't catch them among our participants, we'll make sure we catch that so we can send them around.
I would just throw in, of course, you know, there's the Bereaved Family Circle, which is a group of Israeli and Palestinian mothers and fathers who've lost children on both sides. There is a group that actually ran an alternative Memorial Day last week. There's Project Rosanna, which tries to build bridges between Palestinians and Israelis through health. And there's JSpace, which I think it's important that we continue to support because there's lots of need. And the New Israel Fund actually is the umbrella group which funds some of the groups that you mentioned, Judy. And so if you want to go direct, you can go direct, or if you want an umbrella, you can send some money to the New Israel Fund, which spreads its wealth around 12 or 14 organizations within Israel.
And of course, if you want to keep up with the news and you want a really reliable source of news, you want to take out a subscription to Haaretz.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know JSpaceCanada is working with Haaretz right now to hopefully provide some sort of discount for members. So we tell everyone to keep in touch with us and we'll have some updates on that. Mm-hmm. John, Judy, I want to thank you for taking the time today. It was an awesomely insightful discussion. I also want to thank everyone who joined today's webinar. If we didn't get to answer your questions, I'm sorry, it's not for lack of interest, it's just for lack of time. If you send us an email at info@JSpaceCanada.ca, we'll do our best to connect you with our panelists so you can get an answer. As you remain homebound for the next few weeks and months, JSpaceCanada will be hosting webinars just like the one today, so we can ensure Canadians are kept in the know about important developments in the Middle East. If you're not already, I encourage you to become a member of JSpaceCanada. It's only $36, I believe, a year, or $18 for students. For more information, you can access it on our website at JSpaceCanada.ca. Thanks again to everyone, and we look forward to speaking with you in the coming weeks.
Stay healthy, everyone. Stay safe.